In this episode of Pondering Pods, Paul Stanley explains the steps involved in securing an education, health and care plan, or EHCP. We discuss the importance of thorough assessments and what parents can do if their child or young person's needs aren't being met. EHCPs play a vital role in supporting children and young people with special educational needs. We also discuss the challenges families face, from navigating appeals to the need for independent assessments. If you're currently going through the EHCP process or thinking about applying for your child or young person, this episode will provide insights to help you advocate for the support your child or young person deserves. You can find all the support and signposting discussed in the podcast in the show notes. To find out more about our specialist assessments or our Family Futures Therapy Model, MPP, visit our website www.familyfutures.co.uk. If you would just like to start by, introducing yourself, telling us and the listeners a bit about your background and in what capacity you work for Family Futures, that's a good place to start.
Okay, Paul Stanley. I was previously head of 2 independent specialist schools, residential, both of them, one catering for youngsters aged 7 to 14. Who had a range of difficulties, specific learning difficulties such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia and autism. And then I was head of a large school for the senior age range from 9 through to 17, again residential and similar difficulties. I've been in special education for over 30 years. And been dealing with educational health and care plans or statements, the predecessor, for nearly 30 years. And after retiring from being a headmaster, I became a consultant, helping parents of youngsters with special educational needs, how to get the needs identified, how to get support, and then how to get EHCPs. And also became involved in certain cases in representing them if matters went to tribunals. So I've attended tribunals as an expert witness, and then I changed my role as a parent advisor and representative. One of these cases involved Family Futures, so I became involved with Family Futures. We started off very successfully, which was good, and we've carried on with that. And so I'm a consultant available to Family Futures in terms of advice such as like this, but also in individual parent cases where parents seek support to do with the legal side and how the process runs.
Thank you. What an impressive CV there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And for anyone who's listening, who's wondering, I'm assuming EHCP, some people might have heard or seen that, had that term kind of thrown around, acronym. Explain in a nutshell, if that's possible, what that is.
I'll try. It may be a rather large nutshell.
That's okay.
So it's an education, health and care plan. And it came into being when David Cameron was Prime Minister, who interestingly, he had a son with learning difficulties. And it replaced statements. And first of all, statements and EHCPs were a formal recognition of a young person's learning difficulties. Covers a wide range, but it's just learning difficulties. So it's a formal recognition, formal recording of the difficulties, and recognises that specialist provision needs to be put in place. So Section B of the EHCP records the needs, and Section F records the provision. And if you refer to the Code of Practice for Special Educational Needs and Disability of July 24, it explains how the provision must be specific, mustn't be waffly, mustn't be needs access to. It must detail how many hours of support, who provides the support, and so on. And Section I of the EHCP details the placement, that is the school, that the young person should attend, which could be a mainstream school with additional support, could be a special school, could be an independent special school, could even be a residential school. So an EHCP is a formal document and leads to further funding for the young person. Without the EHCP is a passport to further individual funding. The plan is quite long. It's longer than statements used to be, and they're divided into sections, being communication and interaction. So it's how the young person communicates, talks, use of language. Cognition and learning, basically how the young person learns. SEMH, which stands for social, emotional, mental health and well-being. And of course, what tends to happen is if a young person is not able to achieve at school, if there are other difficulties from their early development, then you get the onset of emotional and behaviour difficulties as well. So they would come in there. And then the last section is physical and sensory, and that is to do with things like dyspraxia, coordination, and sensory processing. So that's basically an EHCP. And once you have one, they are reviewed every year, and they go right up to the age of 25. So they apply both to young people through to adults.
Okay. And they're applicable for anyone. You don't have to be care experienced to have an EHCP. But obviously we work with the families who are adopted or fostered children, or special guardianship children, and families. And those are the families you kind of support and work with through us as a consultant or parent support.
So those families, quite often, you're looking at a complex set of needs to go through a range of those difficulties. And the EHCP is available to everybody who has special needs. So whatever the special needs are. So would you like me to explain the process?
That would be really helpful. Yes, please.
Yep. So basically it starts off with a request for an EHC assessment. So to qualify for a plan, you have to assess whether the young person requires an assessment, which sounds a bit bizarre, but an initial assessment has to take place. Traditionally, it comes from the school. Normally a school, say the primary or secondary school, identifies that the young person is not making progress, talks to parents, and if they believe that the needs go beyond what the school can normally provide, then they contact the local authority and ask for an EHC assessment.
Okay.
It's interesting with a lot of family futures, young people, that their needs are complicated in such a way that it's more to do with, or they appear to be more emotional than to do with mental health well-being. And they're not always picked up by the school. Quite often the boys, if they're not happy in school, will often act as a class clown, mess about a bit, get laughs and so on. Whereas girls, as they mature earlier than boys, are very good at masking. They're very good at hiding what's going on inside. And it's become clear that so many girls are in a pretty awful state emotionally, but the school hasn't picked up any of it because it all happens at home. It doesn't happen in school. So quite often the parents are the first ones to see the problem. And although the local authorities don't always make it known, parents can request an EHC assessment just as much as a school can.
So you don't have to go. So if you're a parent and you have concerns and school aren't picking up on it, like you said, you don't have to go through the school and ask school to request it. They can just approach the local authority.
Parents can go straight to a local authority. That's perfectly admissible. in a way, it's better to go through the school. It's better to have a discussion with the school about the difficulties the parents are having. And hopefully the schools will then say, right, we see the problem, and may then agree that they'll make the request, which is fine. But I've known cases where the schools, even after the discussion, they say, no, she won't qualify, he won't qualify for an EHC assessment, because the schools and local authorities have their own levels that you must cross to qualify for an assessment. And as you can imagine, with some of the children, young people that Family Futures come across, the difficulties are more complex and sometimes not as obvious. And so sometimes you can understand why the schools don't experience the difficulties, so they won't apply. So yes, the parents can go straight ahead. And if they look at the code of practice, how to make a request for an EHC assessment, it is available there. The other point I should make is there are specialist solicitors available who are very experienced in this and will do all the work for the parents. Of course, that comes at a cost. And then there are charities available who will support parents, and there are people like me who are kind of in between a charity and specialist solicitors. So there is help available. But yes, parents can go straight to the local authority if that's required.
So then you've contacted the local authority. Hopefully you've managed to go through school and have kind of school on side for your support. What happens next?
So the local authority will then go back to the school and ask for a series of reports from the school describing things like progress. If the young person is shown to be behind the chronological norms, particularly in literacy, numeracy and across the curriculum, then that helps your case for an assessment. It's a deficit system, so the more the young person is failing, the more obvious that is, the more likely you are to qualify for an EHCP. The more the young person is masking, and particularly if they're of high cognitive ability, they're not fulfilling their potential, but their level is round about chronological expectation. So in theory, chronologically, it's not a deficit, but compared to their cognitive ability, it is a deficit. There are obvious difficulties there. So what happens quite often is parents have already got some assessments that they've funded themselves. For example, if there's a particular language problem, they may have speech and language therapy assessment. If there's a sensory problem, there will be an occupational therapy assessment sometimes. And if they've already been in contact with Family Futures, there may be a report from Family Futures, and all that can go in the evidence that they supply the local authority with. So any records they have, often parents may have done personal tutoring, may have hired a private tutor. So any evidence they have, they send out with the paperwork as well. And then the local authority, when they've got all the reports together, they then make a decision. Parents should be aware that the whole process from requesting an EHC assessment to producing an EHCP is 20 weeks. But again, that timetable is in the code of practice. So hopefully the local authority then comes back and says, yes, we will carry out an EHC assessment. That mainly involves more reports from the school and parents, but also a local authority educational psychologist assessment and report. And once you've got an EHC assessment, not in all, but in most cases, that will result in an EHCP. A draft EHCP will be written, and that will be largely on the content of the report by the local authority educational psychologist, but hopefully will also contain sections from the parents' input and any reports, particularly Family Futures, that accompany the evidence submitted by the parents. If the local authority says thank you, but no, your child doesn't qualify for an EHCP and their needs can be met from within the school resources, then the parents have a right to appeal.
Okay. And that's what you support people with typically, through us especially.
I support parents with how to get their young person's needs identified, the different routes for that, whether they are likely to qualify for an EHCP, and then help them in that process. And then if they have to make appeals, then I support parents through the process. Again, it's in the code of practice. It's not a terribly parent-friendly process. You need to be pretty IT efficient. You need to have access to a lot of photocopying, and you need to be able to deal with the local authority and SEND, or SENDISS, which is the body that deals with the appeals. There's an enormous amount of appeals going on. It increases year by year, so there is a problem there as well. So parents need to have the time, resources, and to be able to deal with this sort of thing.
So what do you do? I mean, obviously you're going to appeal it if your child, you spoke about girls specifically masking and being at the right level, but not being at meeting their specific potential as an individual. If your child falls within that, and you're aware of that and you're going through the process because you really are just going through the motions, and you know that you might have to appeal the application, is there anything you can put in place in the initial application that will help support that additional need? Because you're aware there's not like you said, there's not the deficit, and you're aware that you might have to appeal it. What kind of things could you provide as a parent?
That's a really good point. First of all, if they are in contact with Family Futures and have been with Family Futures for a number of years or a while, any reports that come from Family Futures are like gold dust because of the high level of qualifications, specialisms that Family Futures provide. Because in the end, if it goes to appeal, when it comes to evidence and in the tribunal, the parents may have a rock solid case, but if they just say how it is, and it's, forgive me for saying, but only the parent saying it, then it is subjective versus the local authority evidence, might be the local authority educational psychologist. So it doesn't carry the same weight. But if you have Family Futures specialists saying these things and saying, yes, there should be an EHCP, that carries far more weight. Also, if the parents have commissioned an independent educational psychologist to carry out an assessment, that carries a lot of weight, not as much weight as the local authority educational psychologist, but that's another matter. Because an independent educational psychologist will look at the cognitive profile of the young person, how able are they, but also in some cases there may be a low cognitive profile, a low IQ, not very often, but the cognitive profile plays a big part. Local authorities don't always do a great deal of assessment on that. And the educational psychologist will look at attainment, emotional difficulties, a whole range of things. Will then measure any deficit in specific terms, make a series of recommendations, including whether an EHCP is necessary. And to take that into an appeal is really valuable, as well as possibly a speech and language assessment and possibly an occupational therapy assessment. So if a parent goes in with all those reports, may not need all of them, but some of those reports, that's a good place to be. The problem is because they're independent, parents have to fund them. And kind of overarching this is the need for parents to work out what sort of budget they can put aside and work to, because parents must avoid, if they can, saying, yes, we'll do that and that and that. If their appeal isn't successful, they're in a difficult position.
And so I know I've done a previous podcast with Stephen Mully, our therapy services manager, and we spoke about the Adoption Support Fund, the now Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund, the ASGSF, I believe. And in that, so you can apply for a specialist assessment through Family Futures or through any agencies that offer a specialist assessment in order to qualify for the ASGSF. And I'm wondering if your child's going to need a specialist assessment anyway, as an assessment of need, you can go to an agency that provides that. So that's ourselves or anyone else who provides a specialist assessment. And then use that specialist assessment not only to access the ASGSF, but also to support an application for an EHCP.
It's so confusing for the parents when they start on this process. And anybody who can kind of hold their hand and say, right, this is how the system works, this is the cost issue, and these are the people available who may be able to help. I mean, for example, parents don't know where to find independent speech and language therapists, educational psychologists. The ones that are referred to me come via Family Futures, but obviously there are parents out there who don't know about Family Futures. So any holding of hands we can do and kind of highlight this is where you go, parents, and so they don't feel alone is brilliant. That's what they need.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like quite a challenging process for any parent. More challenging when your child doesn't have really, really obvious needs, or their needs are complex, and that is the children that we work with, children and families we work with who have additional and specific needs. Obviously, the benefits of an EHCP is having that additional support. What can you speak to a little bit what that looks like? So you've hopefully applied and got the support, got the EHCP agreed.
Just before we do that, just to add, if you request an assessment and that is successful and you get the EHCP, or you're successful after an appeal, you then have to look at the content of the EHCP.
Okay.
So the content is really obviously, and the basics are that Section B, you have all the needs in. In Section F, you have the provision for those needs. So you can't have provision in Section F for any need that is not mentioned in Section B. So it's vital that not only from the parental point of view, but they're able to go to Family Futures or educational psychologists, whoever, to check that Section B, because you've got to have the specific listing of all the needs. And as you're saying with Family Futures, you're looking at a complex picture. So it's vital that you get the right terminology. And again, there are certain buzzwords that kind of trigger provision. And very often, or sometimes in local authorities, you get a draft EHCP that is a bit waffly and doesn't list all the specific needs. So Section B has got to be specific, and then Section F has got to be specific. How many hours of specialist support? Who is that specialist support provided for by? What are the qualifications? For example, does the young person have huge sensory processing difficulties and can't cope in certain classroom environments? That needs to be in Section B. So in Section F, what qualifications should the occupational therapy have in terms of providing therapy and provision for this young person? Should it be linked to development trauma? And if so, does the teacher's assistant who works 10 hours a week, is that the right person to provide the therapy? You know, it's that sort of specifics that one has to look at. And Section B and Section F, the provision then drives the placement in Section I. So if you need a higher level of specialist provision, what sort of school can deliver that. And if you can't agree with the local authority on the content of the plan, you can go to appeal for that as well.
Wow. So you, I think, mentioned earlier as well that you're given a draft.
Yes.
So that's the point that you need to, as a parent, you need to go through and check that all of those things, and there's specific buzzwords, very clear, and that's all there before agreeing.
It's almost like going through all your reports and finding these key points and then transferring them. There's a certain language of that's used in the EHCPs, and also the certain legalities, certain things you can do and you can't do. Very few people like writing EHCPs. I'm a bit peculiar because I get some kind of satisfaction out of writing and rewriting EHCPs, and that's in a way the main part of the support I provide. Takes a lot of time, but obviously if you get the EHCP correct, then it's likely to last the young person for 2 or 3 years. They have to be reviewed every year. But if you've really got the kernel of a young person's needs, and of course, with Family Futures, you've got the specialist technical terminology, and you're able to explain how that affects performance in class. Because so many of these young people can't begin to learn in class because of their development trauma, their attachment issues, all gets in the way. And if we're not careful, these young people are just seen as a behaviour problem, and they're taken out of class. Parents have all kinds of struggles to get them into school. Within 10 minutes, they say we can't have them in school.
In a classroom.
And the parents are pulling their hair out. So it's so important that the terminology in the EHCP, particularly for these young people, really are specific, and the provisions such as the MPP therapy and so on is specific.
It just sounds like a really incredibly prohibitive process. You almost sound like you need a degree to do one as a parent, which is quite tricky.
But I think the other point I should have made, Charlotte, is that for parents, it's a very negative process in the way that to qualify for an EHCP, you need to prove failure.
Yeah.
You need to be below a certain level to qualify for specialist support. And so the reports, what we concentrate on in the reports and what the parents say, is where the child is having difficulty, where they're unable to do these things. And of course, everybody wants to shout about the child's potential, what they can do. So the parents have to be aware it can be quite a negative, depressing process, but it is a means to an end. And there is a real dichotomy here, because many parents come to me and Family Futures after they've provided a lot of support already. And this is a bit contentious, but you could argue that the less amount of support the parents provide, the more obvious the young person's difficulties, the more likely you are to qualify for an EHCP.
Wow. But then you're left in a position of, like you said, it's 20 weeks just to get the agreement. So the time frame where you're having to, not assist your child in the way that you would want to, or support your child, it's quite a long time. I hear what you're saying. I'm just.
Well, it can be even worse than that, because there is a possibility that you could have. This is the worst case scenario. It very rarely happens, but you might have to appeal 3 times. You ask for an EHC assessment and they say no, you appeal that. They carry out an EHC assessment, you win the appeal, they carry out the assessment. Most cases they will then write a plan. In some cases they say we've done the assessment, they don't qualify for a plan. You appeal that, you win. They write an EHCP, you can't agree on the content, you appeal against that. Quite often it's 1 or 2 appeals, but it could be 3. At the moment, SENDIASS is having a terrible, terrible job to cope with the number of appeals. At the moment, the waiting time between registering an appeal and having your appeal heard is over a year. So that has obvious repercussions.
Trying the positive spin here.
Apologies.
Hard to find. No, that's okay. I think it's really helpful to be realistic and talk about what it's really like and the challenges parents are going to face, and ultimately the challenges their children are going to face while this is ongoing.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've also had cases where parents have put the young person in a special school and started paying for it themselves. And then they go for an EHC assessment. And of course, the problem then is sometimes the young people have started to improve, which makes the case more difficult. But coming back to costs, for some parents, it is worth considering whether it is worth going through the EHCP process and the cost that would involve, as compared to not bothering with the process, finding a specialist school that can meet their young person's needs and paying the fees. But I have to stress, most of those type of schools, particularly if they're residential, the fees are prohibitive for parents to pay. And of course you can't pay fees just for 2 or 3 years and then pull the young person out.
No, you have to.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's a long-term commitment. That was sort of what I was going to say, is that what all the alternatives, which is what you're saying, but the whole process, the cost is prohibitive. Having to, some people would look at a big form out.
Yes.
All of the professional terminology and
yes.
go, I don't know how to approach this whatsoever. And then also getting the support, someone to support you through the process. If you don't already have that knowledge, if you're not a professional working in this industry, how would you approach it? You'd need someone, so you'd have to pay for that.
On a slightly more positive note,
oh, great.
There are solicitors out there, and it's how I work as well, where parents could say, I need a bit of help with this, but I can do the other bit. Can you just explain what this? And it is possible to get some help like that if you find the right solicitors or right sort of person.
I guess the best way of approaching it, if you are a parent of an adopted child or a special guardianship child or young person, would be to go through the ASGSF for the specialist assessment, which is funded, there is an allocated government fund, and then to approach the EHCP, because as you said, then you have the specialist assessment by either ourselves or someone similar, and you have that in your corner for your child's needs and for the EHCP. Otherwise, it is an expensive, long process.
The one particular area I've been involved with Family Futures is that if Family Futures therapy is required, then at the moment we attempt to get it into Section F, because Section F, if you have to appeal, the appeal tribunal will decide on what goes into Section F. Whereas if it's in Section, I think it's Section G, if it goes into health, if you appeal it, the appeal tribunal have no jurisdiction on it. So there is a further. I mean, recently I've been involved in not recently, but over the last few years I've been involved in a couple of appeals where we've got the Family Futures therapy in Section F because we've proved it's an educational need. Because the thing that comes over and over again is that these young people, unless you deal with the emotional, mental well-being side, they can't begin to access the learning.
This isn't everyone's experience of EHCPs.
No, and I don't deal with the whole spectrum. I've dealt with a fairly wide spectrum, but not the whole spectrum. And for example, I'm not usually involved with children with a high level of physical disability.
Okay.
And the experience of parents of those may be totally different. So I'm not saying it's totally across the board, but particularly for parents of youngsters who have cognitive potential, say at least of average cognitive ability, and particularly those with higher cognitive ability, and particularly those young people who are very good at masking, who are fine in school. I mean, to the extent that the teachers haven't noticed them. And of course, if you've got a class of 34 children, and the young person's behaving, and some girls in particular, their masking is absolutely brilliant. You wouldn't believe how effective it is. Above average, the average and above average cognitive ability, they tend to find it very difficult because the failing of the young person isn't as obvious, just as their emotional turmoil isn't as obvious.
Within our conversation, there's been certainly what I would think of some really, really useful nuggets of information. And as we mentioned, I will be putting any useful links or things we've referred to in the caption. And you were going to just end on a positive note, I believe. You're about to say something.
If you have some form of specialist support, the success rate tends to be high.
So really, it's information gathering as much as possible.
Yes.
And I guess feeling like you're saying some of the masking that's done specifically by girls is so impressive that it is hard to see, and people aren't picking up on it. But I think for parents to maybe feel confident in, they know their child, they know, you know your child best, and if you feel they need that additional support, to really go for it, and that these are the things that you need to put in place, which is what we've discussed. You know your child best, you know that they could be achieving more and their potential, and to feel confident in that, and probably to reach out to other parents who are going through similar things, and to have that support, that professional support, which you're going to need kind of on side and in your report, but also have that other support from other parents who can kind of validate you and say, no, you know your child, they're not achieving their potential, they need more support, you're right to fight for this.
Yes.
It's just a shame they have to fight.
Well, absolutely. Yes, the parents feel incredibly isolated. They're the only parents having to do this, and of course they're not. So if they can be put in contact with other parents, that would be brilliant.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Family Futures podcast, why not subscribe or leave us a review? Want to know more about Family Futures? Visit our website www.familyfutures.co.uk. Thanks for listening.